Good evening, everyone. We left off on page 41. Kiri suddenly spotted a blue and white striped shirt and took off quickly in that direction. "Kyle!" she called. Kyle turned around and saw Kiri. He ran toward her, tears streaming down his cheeks. Kiri embraced the little boy as soon as he was within arm's length. Meanwhile, Greg and Justin took point and made sure no one tried to shoot them now that they had their bait, if that was why they left Kyle here. "Are you okay, honey?" Kiri asked him, dropping to one knee and wiping the tears off his cheeks with her thumb. He nodded and hugged her again, continuing to cry. "It's okay, Kyle, it's okay," she said softly, and picked up the little boy. She turned to Justin and said, "Get an EMT over here, as close as possible." Justin nodded and radioed in an ambulance, and the three CSIs walked toward the walkway where it was wide enough. Greg pushed the public back, instructing them to stay away from the area where the ambulance was about to land. Kiri put Kyle down, but still held his hand as they waited. She could already hear the siren and knew the ambulance had been standing by. Kyle didn't seem to care. He was content to cling to Kiri's arm and cry. The ambulance came, and Kiri sat down on the gurney with Kyle, knowing he wouldn't want to be separated just yet. "Kyle, the nice paramedic's going to make sure you aren't hurt, so you have to let go for just a minute. I'll be right here, I promise," she said softly to him. He nodded and let go slowly. Kiri stood up, but held his hand from beside the gurney. "There you go," she said with a smile. The paramedic began gently checking him, making sure he wasn't hurt anywhere. He smiled at Kyle and appeared non-threatening. "Kyle, do you hurt anywhere?" he asked him after he was done with the physical checkup. Kyle said, shaking his head. "When was the last time you ate something, sport? Do you remember?" "I dunno," Kyle answered. "Okay, partner," the man said kindly. "Do you remember when the last time you slept was?" "I dunno," Kyle said again. The paramedic nodded and turned to Kiri. He asked quietly, "Any symptoms?" Kiri shook her head. "No, not so far. He's just upset." "I can't find anything obviously wrong with him, but our scanners show that someone has taken a small blood sample. The needle site is on his left arm. I'd take him to the hospital, get him checked out for potential internal injuries, but you can bring him in yourself if you'd like." Kiri nodded in understanding. "All right, thank you," she said, and lifted Kyle off the gurney. "Anything else I can do?" the paramedic asked kindly. "Not right now, but thank you." The paramedic nodded and held out his hand after taking off the nitrile glove. "Peter Sanders." "Lieutenant Kiri O'Malley," she said with a smile. "Good to meet you, and I'll see you later." She took Kyle's hand and said, "Let's go see Amber." "Okay," Kyle said, a bit more enthusiastic. He liked that idea. They needed to discuss what had happened, but Kyle was a bit traumatized right now, and he didn't need too many questions. Kiri knew she could question him after he had seen Amber. What would really calm him down, though, was seeing his father, and unfortunately, that was against protocol right now. They walked to Kiri's car, guarded by Greg and Justin. As soon as Greg, Kyle, and Kiri were in the car, Justin turned and went to Sarah's car, where she and Parker were waiting. Kiri let Kyle sit up front with her, far from the airbag, where he quietly played with his lizard in his hands. Kiri didn't press him for information, and Greg knew better than to say anything if Kiri wasn't, so they sat in silence as they rode back to the station. Kiri couldn't help but feel a bit of pride, but mostly she felt relief. They had found him. He was safe now, and she wouldn't let anything happen to him from this point forward. The question was, who had taken him in the first place, and why? 4 days ago. Sarah rubbed her eyes and blinked at the large screen in front of her, waiting for it to come into focus again. "Need coffee?" Greg asked, coming into the room with 2 coffees and a smile. "Thanks, Greg," Sarah said. "I've been up for way too long." She took the coffee and sighed, looking back at the screen. Victim 1, Wendy Hunter, a florist. Shot with a 9mm that we've confirmed to be the same one that shot the other 2 Vics. She was 48 years old. She had a husband and a child. She owned the floral shop on Butterfield Road. "My parents live near Butterfield," Greg said absently. "Really," Sarah stated, still studying the screen. "So she's victim 1. Victim 2 was Rick Fanning, 60 years old, retired, owned a boat on Burnham Park Harbor, Lake Michigan. He was driving it to do some service on it when he was shot. Stopped at a fast food restaurant on Ogden. When he was working, he worked as a chemist for Stamp Alloys." "Really," Sarah stated, still studying the screen. "So she's victim 1. Victim 2 was Rick Fanning, 60 years old, retired, owned a boat on Burnham Park Harbor, Lake Michigan. He was driving it to do some service on it when he was shot. Stopped at a fast food restaurant on Ogden. When he was working, he worked as a chemist for Stamp Alloys. Finding ways to make newer, stronger metals, Greg said. Right. Not the same type of chemist as our pharmaceutical man, Vic 3, Joseph Portez, 25 years old. Started working for Thurman a few weeks ago, fresh out of college and ready to go. So, not seeing a connection? Are you? She asked. Greg stared at the screen, with the 3 victims' profiles on it. He shook his head. Not really. We're missing some pieces. Let's go over the evidence results again. No sign of a struggle with any of the 3 Vics. None of them had changed their normal routine except Mr. Fanning, who usually didn't go out to his boat to do service on it in autumn. His wife said they were planning on taking one more trip before it got really cold. That was why he went. He said so on his last choice, actually. I wish my choices asked me whether I wanted to take a trip on my boat before it got cold, Greg said with a small smile. Sarah chuckled. Keep dreamin'. Anyway, about the other 2's choices. Nothing out of the ordinary. Joseph was asked if he wanted to stay with Thurman and put up with a Miss Gretchen, who apparently is competing with him for the next highest position, or if he wanted to move to a different pharmaceutical company. He chose to stay. We checked into Miss Gretchen. Nothing points toward her wanting anything except a higher position. She didn't have a potential vendetta against Joseph. She was simply competitive. Not competitive enough to kill him. She took a choice, Greg, yesterday. Where were you? Out on that other case. Car accident on purpose. You saw it, right? Sarah nodded and said, Gretchen isn't a likely suspect. I mean, we won't rule out anything until we're sure who shot them, but Gretchen's profile is nowhere close to a shooter's. Her last choice was completely work-related. If she was planning on going on a shooting spree, the choice would have caught it. Greg nodded. People pop up out of nowhere, but not often, he said. Right, Sarah said. So as far as forensic evidence is concerned, we fingerprint analyzed just about everything. They were very careful and probably very experienced. No fingerprints except for the Vicks. Trace found a fiber only used in waterproof backpacks, though, at the scene of the Portez murder. Which tells us that they need to carry something? That's what Kiri thinks, Sarah said. Greg nodded. He was about to say something when Nikki opened the door and said, Kiri just got a call. She wants all of us down to... Nikki looked down at the electronic writing pad and said, 6675 Garfield Avenue, Hinsdale. Hinsdale? Greg asked in disbelief. That was hardly a crime spot in Chicago. But nonetheless, he logged out of the computer and watched as the screen went blank. Then, as Sarah turned off the lights, they both left the room and headed to the cars. Kiri was the first CSI on the scene. She took off her sunglasses as she entered through the front door of the house, just as she had 2 years before. Sam, she called. Over here, Lieutenant, a voice said. Kiri turned toward the voice and walked through the family room to get to the sitting area where Sam Butler, a young woman of about 20 or so years, stood talking to an officer. Kiri looked sympathetically at Sam and said, Officer, I can take it from here. Were you done questioning? Just about, ma'am. Here are my notes, the officer said as he handed Kiri the pad. Kiri nodded, took the pad, and waited till the officer walked away. Then she opened her arms to Sam. The shorter, black-haired woman hugged Kiri and closed her eyes. Lieutenant, I'm so stupid. You aren't stupid. You had no control over what happened. Do you understand? Kiri asked firmly. I didn't set the security alarm. If I had set the security alarm, the surveillance would have picked him up. Do you know who did this? Was it them? Kiri sighed. I don't know yet, but I'm going to find out. What I need you to do for me right now is to take a breath and tell me everything you saw, okay? Sam nodded, and they sat down together. I came home from Taekwondo. I tried to call Chuck and tell him to get some macaroni and cheese or something on the stove. I was starving. He didn't answer. I got a little nervous and I sped up. I got in a fender bender with this guy. That took about a half hour to sort out. We didn't report it to the police. We just exchanged insurances. It wasn't that bad. Then I drove home. She took a deep breath. It's okay, Sam. Take your time. Sam nodded and pulled a tissue out of her pocket. She wiped her eyes and blew her nose, attempting not to cry audibly. But the tears still came. It was uncontrollable. I came in through the garage door. Chuck was in the kitchen. And you saw him, Kiri finished softly. Is that when you called me? Sam nodded and said, I knew I could call you, Lieutenant. I was afraid to call anyone else. I don't know if they can bug phones or not, but I knew you'd come. Kiri nodded and smiled. She put her hand on the younger woman's arm and said, "It'll be all right. I'm going to do everything I can to catch whoever did this to your brother, all right?" Sam nodded. "All right," Curie said. "I need to go look at some evidence. My team just got here. Officer," she called, and the officer came over. "Could you take Miss Butler to the station, please, and make sure she's comfortable?" The officer nodded, and Sam stood up. "Thank you, Lieutenant," Sam said, and Curie smiled as Sam and the officer left. Curie walked into the kitchen where she saw Chuck Butler lying on the floor face down, gunshot wound to the back. Dr. Wesley Hans had just gotten there and walked past Greg, who was taking pictures of the victim and all of the evidence he could find. "Hans?" Curie asked. The ME looked the victim over and said, "I'll be able to tell you in a minute." He began lifting Chuck's arms, feeling for defensive fractures, looking for signs of a struggle. After a moment of inspection, Hans said, "I'm not seeing any signs of a struggle. No defensive wounds. And since he was on his stomach, and from what I'm seeing in terms of positioning of the bullet, it was the most likely cause of death. It probably went through his heart. It wasn't through and through. He must have either trusted whoever shot him, or he was told to turn around, and he complied. I'm guessing time of death was about an hour or two ago. It wasn't long ago at all." Curie nodded, sadly looking at Chuck. She hadn't seen him in 2 years, but the last time she did, he was just being informed of his parents' deaths at the hands of the international gang Diablo. She had apprehended 2 gang members for those murders. She had a suspicion more were involved, but the evidence only pointed to 2. "Did you know this boy, Curie?" Hans asked her, his short blonde hair illuminated in the light streaming in from the window. Curie nodded slowly. "I did. It was before you joined the team, Hans." Hans nodded in comprehension and said no more. He started readying the body for transport. Curie walked out of the room and approached Justin. "Find anything?" "Nothing yet. Still looking, of course," Justin said, shining his flashlight on the floor and attempting to find evidence. "How are Greg and Sarah and Nikki doing?" "Greg's taking pictures. Sarah said she would dust for fingerprints. Nikki's looking for evidence outside." Curie nodded. They were quiet for a moment before Justin said, "I'm told they got in through the front door. Security alarm wasn't on. What was Chuck thinking? That it had been 2 years and that he didn't have to set it?" Justin shook his head. "He shouldn't have had to. These people deserve some peace and quiet." Curie nodded and patted his arm. "We'll catch them." Justin smiled slightly and said, "That's the idea. We'll read more tomorrow."